Welcome into K-State Online. I'm Mason Voth. That is Drew Galloway, our Tuesday KSO show for you. And we are going to go a little bit deeper into a topic that we broached yesterday because I asked Drew about it. We saw some additions to the offensive line through the transfer portal again during the spring window when, you go back a couple of months, we weren't necessarily sure how many players K-State would add in the spring, if any. They have added some, and most interestingly, the offensive line has been the focal point, and one player, JB Nelson, you and I both seem to agree, seems like he would probably be in line to get starter reps next season for K-State after, they addressed adding offensive linemen in the portal in the winter. We know that they have a pretty big crop of guys that could be in the mix on the offensive line over the course of the next 2-3 seasons that will be fighting to get out there. So, I asked you yesterday, Drew, like, is that something to be concerned about? Is this K-State trying to build legit depth, or did they sit around and go, man, we don't have any good options right now, or enough good options? We think we're going to be a bad offensive line. We need to improve in some way, and that's why we see a bunch of portal additions in the spring.
Yeah, I think that it's still more about getting good and better depth because you needed guys that had played legitimate snaps at the Power 4 level. Because even some of the winter additions didn't have like a ton of snaps underneath their belt. So now you get some older guys that have came in that have played. I think like Enos played like 389 snaps at Pitt last year. JB Nelson was kind of a spot starter at times for Penn State. Those guys have played legitimate snaps at this level, and to bring them in this late, I think, is a big deal. It gives you more options, more flexibility. The thing that really intrigues me the most about, like why I said that this is something we could really talk about, is that it does provide so much flexibility that you can really work on finding out what your best five is, because Andrew Leingang, along with Enos and Nelson, can both play inside and outside along the offensive line. You probably have two starters, maybe even three with Leingang, all nailed down with George Fitzpatrick, Sam Hecht, and potentially Andrew Leingang. The other two spots are kind of up for grabs, and that would be like, does Amos Talalay beat out Taylor Portier? Does JV Nelson take that right tackle spot from Gus Hawkins? Does John Pastore play right tackle and end up beating out both of them? So it kind of gives you a lot more flexibility on like finding out what your best five is, because I think that you have at least two guys that you know for sure in your best five. Because I've seen a lot of discourse on KS about like replacing Sam Hecht at center. He was second team All Big 12 last season. Why would you go away from that at center? So then you have those two with Fitzpatrick, because Fitzpatrick has been somebody that as soon as he stepped onto campus has been somebody that's been talked about doing a lot of the right things, kind of in that inline to start role. And then the last three spots, it's really up for grabs, and it's going to come down to who has a better fall/training camp.
Or is it a red flag in any way that some of the guys that they were young that we've seemingly have heard about year after year that, hey, they're in the pipeline, these guys are coming? Is it a red flag that none of those guys have been just surefire locks to slide in with, a guy like Sam Hecht, who was an all Big 12 player last year, and then George Fitzpatrick, who was one of your priority ads in the transfer portal this offseason?
I would say maybe. Like, I think that Andrew Leingang is probably in that third spot. Like, he's pretty much a starter, but not totally yet. So like that would kind of be something that you could look at. But like then John Pastore is more been about him not being healthy at times and being kind of inconsistent on health that has really held him back. But Chris Kleiman talked about him in his last spring press conference, talking about how Pastore is getting healthier now. Then it's guys like Gus Hawkins, who played in one game last season as a true freshman. You wouldn't feel as comfortable with him starting as somebody like JB Nelson or even John Pastore, because Pastore still has more playing time reps than Gus Hawkins does. And then you have guys like you have just some other younger guys that are kind of in that pipeline of like, okay, we think that they can play in the next few years, like Navarro Shunky and Kyle Rockers, but you want to have them kind of take that reign more like next year or a couple years from now, because this whole spring window to me feels like really wanting to maximize the time that you have with Avery Johnson. If you really look at the offensive line, I think K-State has 6 or 7 guys that could potentially be on the 2 deep along the offensive line that will be out of eligibility after this upcoming season. So I think that it's more about getting older guys, maximizing your time with Avery, because you want to have as many guys that can protect him as possible that you feel comfortable with, and then just kind of seeing what happens next year. And you could potentially reload this and do kind of the same thing next year.
Yeah, and so we talked about, which they would probably have to, if you're thinking you're trying to give your best shot with Avery Johnson this year. There's a chance that you're trying to do the same thing next year, whether it's repeating the success you have this year or once again trying to get to the peak of what you want with Avery Johnson. But looking at this offensive line and the way that it constructs, we know that last week the messaging was thought that things kind of wore down later on in the year. That was part of the November struggles, not able to get enough push. Guys were kind of struggling because K-State was relying on mainly just 5 guys the entire time.
And I would say he was exactly right in that assessment. Like the dip in offensive line play and how the offense played really coincided. And I think that you could tell that they were getting worn down.
So with that, what do you think a rotation looks like in that? Like how do you prevent that wear and tear happening? And is it a matter of, hey, all season we're rotating, or is it rotating earlier on when you think maybe you can sustain it, and then when you do get to the 1st of November and you're playing Houston in the rain, where you go, okay, we're going to stick with our 5 best guys because this is a crappy game and crappy conditions, and we need to pull this through. We need guys we can trust out there. Like, how would that look to you?
I think that it's rotating guys earlier and probably more often. Like, you don't need some of your offensive linemen. The one guy that I will say probably needs to take 95% of the snaps, maybe even more than that, it is Sam Hecht, because you don't really want to mess with what you have at center. But some of the other guys, you can come in and like plug and play some other guys and put them in different spots and give some guys a little bit of a break, because you don't want them to wear down like that. And to have 9 guys now that you really feel comfortable with playing in situations, I think just provides a little bit more stability, because you don't want to get worn down. And the other thing with that is that like there are probably going to be more times this year, from kind of how Chris Kleiman sounded, that if the game is more out of reach, but it's still on like that 3 scores could go down to 2 scores with like 10 minutes left, it kind of sounds like K-State's going to go the route of, okay, this is now we can put our backups in, where that hasn't always been the case for K-State. Like I remember it was like 31-7 against Arizona late in the game, and the starters were still in, and everybody was a little bit antsy about that. So it sounds like they're kind of moving away from that now this year.
Yeah, which is probably a welcome thing for many fans to hear, because it has been a pretty uh, reasonable complaint at times. I think if you look at the situation and how things have worked out, because yeah, it not that things always happen in those moments, but they certainly can, and it is just more wear and tear. And you go and look at games last year where, go back to, let's see, I can go and find, K-State was up 38-18 with, let's see what time was left on the clock there. With 8.5 minutes left in the game against West Virginia, Avery Johnson goes back out there. And then fortunately for K-State, West Virginia, they were credit them for playing to win. They turned it over on downs at their own 29, and then K-State punched in. But I know that was one where people were questioning, hey, what are you kind of doing here? It wasn't until that very final possession that K-State sent some other guys in there, and it was, like Joe Jackson getting touches. And you mentioned the Arizona game being one of those where it's, hey, this thing is tucked away. What's the game plan here? What are we thinking? And I think you go through and you then look at how things kind of played out in the Cincinnati game. There was more of that. Avery Johnson was still in, but they added some more guys in the mix with that, like 12 minutes left against Cincinnati when K-State was up, I think at that point, 34-9 going into that possession. So that's the thing where I think they started to learn. They realized it too late last year that it had not burnt them like I think it did last season in previous years, even though I think this is something that we've seen over the years at all positions. But offensive line, I think, is the most important one where we could see it, most seasons under Chris Kleiman. And there's certainly a reason, I'm sure, why those guys were still out there. And there are certain games where you're going to be able to justify it a little bit more. Like I mentioned, the West Virginia one. I think it was reasonable to assume West Virginia was not going to win that game, but I will give the leeway to Chris Kleiman and say, like, if you're the head coach, you have to be coming up with scenarios in your head to where, hey, this thing is not over yet. Like, how do we protect ourselves? I could see where you say being up only 20 points with, 10 minutes left in the game, that's too early to kind of call off the dogs. Crazier things have happened,
I would say yes to that, but at certain positions, you can take guys
Yes.
out. Like, you don't have to take everybody out, but like that could be a time where you get some backup offensive linemen in for sure.
Yeah, that's the thing, and that's where I think, like the Cincinnati game where we started to see maybe a little bit more of that, and just kind of a better understanding of how to maneuver and handle those situations a little bit later on, because like you can go through and look, um, they still had the starting offensive line there in the game when K-State was up 21 points with 12 minutes to go in that game against West Virginia. That's where, we've heard so much about how good these offensive linemen in waiting are. You should at least be able to trust them in that situation, especially because a game like that, like Avery Johnson was having no problem, DJ Giddens was having no problem, the receivers were having, like, guys were getting open, making plays. Like, they probably would have been able to. Anyways, that's just the rotation thing is going to be fascinating to watch this year, and we're
Yes.
going to probably fairly early on get an understanding of it. Probably not in the game against Iowa State and Ireland, but like week one. Now, week one is a little bit dependent on the main guys going out and taking care of their own business. We know that K-State started pretty sluggish last year in the game against UT Martin, so it took the number ones a little bit more time out there.
But you still got
But
the backups in that game too.
yeah, but like, are you going to be able to do it earlier? You would like to do it a little bit snappier of a pace in those type of games, and then this is the downfall of like playing Army. You just don't know how that game's going to play out. But theoretically, you would like to think that your G5 game, you're also going to be able to do that. We know that was not the case last year at Tulane either. You were going down to the bitter end with everything. So I think it's going to be interesting to watch. And do you truly believe that was the biggest reason for the collapse in November last year? Because I think that's the other important part about the offensive line conversation is, are they being more fall guy here and certainly contributed to the problem, or was that the main issue for K-State last year? Because the offense was bad against Houston, they were bad against Arizona State, and they weren't great against Iowa State.
I mean, it's hard to say that it's not that, because if you look at what K-State did last year, their number one thing that they were really good at was running the football. Last year, up until November, K-State was a very, very, very good rushing team. And the losses later on in the season, K-State couldn't run the ball anymore. And that is all on the offensive line and just being more physical than who you're lining up against. And I think that another component that kind of has been downplayed a little bit, because is just something that I think everybody's kind of noticed, but nobody's really kind of talked about yet, is that this K-State offensive line is going to be much bigger than last year, and even I think it might be the biggest offensive line under Chris Kleiman. I think Sam Hecht might be the only person in K-State's two deep that's going to be under 300 pounds. So you're also getting bigger along the offensive line. So you think that that will also help in November in the late stages of the year, because last year's offensive line was a little bit more on the lighter side. You also had them wear down a little bit. I think that it's not really them kind of being the fall guys. I think that it truly kind of was the offensive line, because let's be honest, last year's team was inconsistent at best in the passing game, but they were at their best in the passing game when they could go play action.
Yeah, I mean, think about the Colorado game.
Yes.
They were able to make some hay in the passing game there. I think they did well against Oklahoma State. West Virginia, like they carved up West Virginia through the air.
But even West Virginia, they couldn't run the ball in that game.
Yeah,
And
that's true.
there were a lot of times last year where they couldn't run the ball. And some of that just falls on the offensive line, because you have to be able to make something happen there. And again, when you had a sophomore quarterback who was at his best in play action, if you can't run the ball, you're not going to be able to effectively have play action work for you either.
Yeah, I mean, you think about it and you look at like the KU game last year, which happened in the midst of all this. And this is kind of what makes it all the more impressive in some ways that K-State was able to sneak that game out, is because the problems that face K-State over the next 4 games, they were there in that game against KU, and K-State still overcame it. And KU, the problems that had faced them in essentially I guess the 7 games before they played that one, were kind of starting to evaporate. Like you were starting to see more shades of the KU that you wanted to. DJ Giddens in that game against KU, 102 yards on 18 carries. That's 5.7 yards a touch, but he had a 54-yard run. So again, this is a guy runs like over the course of the season. You just don't go take away all of his big runs and tell me what his average was. Well, no, he broke those runs off. But I think in situations like this, you can look at it and say, okay, so DJ Giddens for most of the game, 17 carries for 48 yards. That's not going to cut it for what K-State needs to do, especially for a running back as good as DJ Giddens. And so that is one of those things where I think you could start to see some of the leaks, some of the problems there. K-State was just able to overcome it because they forced turnovers in a fortunate way in that game, and they got enough big plays at the right time from some of their key players like Avery Johnson, DJ Giddens, and shout out to Chris Tennant.
I mean, they even beat the hell out of West Virginia, like I said, and like you could see that the leaks were starting to come there because they couldn't run the ball.
Yeah.
That game, they couldn't run at West Virginia until West Virginia effectively just quit.
Yeah. Yeah. And you go look at what they did against West Virginia. Giddens was 19 carries for 57 yards. That's not very good. K-State only ran the ball 26 times in that game. They threw it 29. So it was all there. And K-State also ended up coming up with some big turnovers in that game as well, where they forced 2 interceptions, one of which was a pick six. Like those were kind of critical. It felt like the last time K-State was at their peak was that Colorado game. And the offensive line may not have been having the most struggles at that point, but like Avery Johnson got dinged up in that game. DJ Giddens got dinged up in that game and kind of set those guys back a little bit, I think, for the next couple. The other thing that I think factors into the offensive line and what we might see from them this year is the running styles that you'll see from Dylan Edwards and Joe Jackson compared to what they had to do for DJ Giddens last year. And they also have a new offensive line coach in Brian LePack, since Connor Riley is with the Cowboys now. So with the changes that are going on with the running backs that they're going to be protecting for, and then their coaching that they're going to receive, how does that factor into what we see from K-State's O-line this season?
Yeah, it'll be different because you can't just run the same stuff that you ran for DJ Giddens, for Dylan Edwards, and Joe Jackson, because it's not going to work. Like you're going to need more guys that are out in space, and probably a little bit more zone scheme than power scheme. And then with Brian LePack, it's just going to be fascinating because we haven't really seen like Brian LePack uh, a lot in like the coaching standpoint during games. I know he was on the field last year, but with tight ends, it's just so much more different than offensive line. Like I'm really excited. The K-State offensive line, defensive line camp is June 1st. I am so excited to watch Brian LePack coach and teach the offensive line at that camp, because it gives you like more of an insight on what he's going to be like with the K-State offensive line, because it's just so different. The offensive line is a whole different animal compared to any other position on a roster, and it takes kind of like that certain voice in the room. So I'm fascinated to see how Brian LePack coaches it. Brian LePack, again, like it is everything that we've seen with him has kind of turned into gold. He's turned the tight ends at K-State into one of the best position groups in the entire country last year. The early returns of him as an offensive line coach on the recruiting trail are already coming up really good. So I anticipate that his coaching will be just as good, but I'm fascinated to see like what does the coaching really look like and how different is it than Connor Riley? Because Connor
Yeah.
Riley was not afraid to really get up in your face.
Yeah. Very intense individual, Connor Riley. So, last thing I'll ask you, this isn't necessarily offensive line specific, but this goes back to what I asked you, if you truly believe that, hey, the offensive line was the number one issue in the November collapse last year. Um, is it easier and the better path for the message to kind of be, hey, we think that it was the offensive line, because you don't want to say that you might have some current concerns about how Avery Johnson performed in that final month, because like the bad turnovers against Houston, Arizona State, Iowa State, like decision making was probably at its worst last season for Avery Johnson in that final month.
Yeah, I would say that it's a little bit of both, but I think that again, it is so like not sexy to talk about, but the offensive line really kind of sets the tone for what an offense is going to be and what it looks like. And I think that there are times where like you probably saw Avery press a little bit too much last year down the stretch. And some of that just comes from him being a true sophomore quarterback that didn't have a ton of experience.
And so that's where I will in turn, that was somewhat of a question where I kind of knew what the answer might be there, but I wanted to put you on the spot with it. What I would have thrown out there and suggested was that if the offensive line is struggling, to what you're saying, Avery Johnson probably pressing a little bit. It also just makes things a whole lot tougher for him. Number one, if he's trying to throw the ball. And then number two, if he's not getting any help in the run game, like that's also going to make it difficult when you need to throw it. Because that really is what kicked it off last year for K-State. And that's why when you say that you truly believe it, and this is what the message from K-State has been, K-State, we knew it at the time. They threw the ball way too many times in that game against Houston last year.
Because they
That
had to, because they couldn't run the ball.
Exactly. And that shouldn't have happened in that game last year. We talked about it at the time and compared it, I know, to other ones that were going on. But in that game, K-State threw the ball 39 times against Houston. Houston threw the ball 12 times in the game. By the way, they were 12 of 12 on their passes in that game. But they only threw the ball 12 times. They ran it 40. And they ran it 40 times for an average of 3 yards a carry. So, like, that's where the real issue was. And then, the turnover played into it. But the turnovers came late, and that was when K-State was having to force it and kind of, really push the issue and everything there. I'll be fascinated to see, and maybe we get it early on if the offensive line is better, to know how much that contributed to some of the problems with Avery Johnson. Because I think up until the Houston game of the season, like I didn't really have any major issues. I thought it was a fine year. And I still think Avery Johnson is a really good player. I think that he's going to end up being really good for K-State still. But that last month of the season did pour some more questions into my head than I really wanted to have. I didn't want to have this lingering feeling throughout the offseason of, I can see this not working out the way that I anticipated it with Avery Johnson. And that's like going to be the prevailing concerning thought for K-State fans over, well, now you think about it, over the next 7 months until the game's done in Arlington with whoever's playing in it. That's going to be something that sticks in the back of your head, and the offensive line, maybe they are really the ones that need to answer that question.
Well, I mean, if we're looking at this from more of like what happened last year, they beat Houston if they can run the ball because they don't have to throw it when Avery Johnson threw the bad interception against Houston. Like if they had any kind of success running the ball, they wouldn't have had to throw it, or they wouldn't have thought that they had to throw it in that situation.
Yeah, no, that's totally fair and on the money there. And I would, go back and you can look at other games and situations of where like weather has played a factor. You throw the ball that many times in rain, more times than not, you're going to lose. Like the kind of rain that you were experiencing there, it's just not going to work out for you. So I don't know. I figured it was interesting to discuss all that mixed in with offensive line and kind of what we think the offense will look like. I mean, do you think with Iowa State being the first game on the schedule, that's something that we'll be able to tell pretty quickly? Or is this where like week 0 having to play a good team versus a good team is going to make it kind of tough? Because, you could see some sloppiness. Like think about the first couple of weeks of like a Major League Baseball season. Like there's more strikeouts. Like the offense looks like it's in shambles. And so, does this team really suck on offense, or are they just trying to figure it out? Some teams you look at them and go, okay, they're just trying to figure it out. The Royals might just suck on offense. So, like, are we going to be able to know early on in that game against Iowa State, or at least by the end of that Iowa State game, how things are shaping up?
I think that we'll know a little bit more about the offensive line and the offense as a whole after the Iowa State game, but I don't know if we won't know a whole picture. And that's what makes college football so fun, but so hard to really determine where a team is at, because you only get 12 bullet points throughout a season on like what did you do that Saturday or Friday now.
Yeah, true. The Big 12, got to watch out for those Fridays. K-State will get one against Arizona. K-State, Iowa State, next game up for college football, August 23rd in the Aer Lingus College Football Classic. If you're still trying to make your way over to Dublin for the game, cats2ireland.com is going to hook you up with everything that you need to know there. Drew, have you been to cats2ireland.com recently to check things out?
Not recently.
Okay. Well, you should have. You should have gone there recently. And I just want you to know that as it stands, the last time things were looking, it's still very 50-50 in terms of how things are playing out with the travel of Iowa State and K-State fans.
Are they going to get to that 49,000 that you promised?
I don't know. No word on that yet. We're going to wait and see. But if you are still looking to get some of those travel packages, they are still out there, but some of them disappearing quickly. So some of you out there have watched this and said, cats2ireland.com, calling my name. If you want the 3-city 8-night trip, it's going to get you stopping in Galway, Dublin, and Kerry. One room remaining on that sucker right now. So you better hop on it if you want to get everything that's included. I'll tell you what it is. You're going to get to see a bunch of different, sites and buildings when you're there throughout Ireland. You get the 8 nights, you get your game ticket. You're going to get the Dublin attraction ticket, a daily full Irish breakfast, exclusive commemorative gifts and credentials, and an experience on location, on-site tour director. So like, that's what you're looking at here. Hop in on that. Also some other ones. I know some may be sitting out there and going, do I want to be there for 8 nights? You probably do. Is that manageable for you? I don't know. It's a once in a lifetime trip. Maybe you make it be manageable. I would certainly sign up for 8 nights as it stands right now. Maybe my attitude will change when my daughter's older than 2 weeks. But there are also packages that are lesser than that, where you're only going to see 2 cities. So you're there for just 6 nights. Or you say, hey, business trip, we're going to Dublin only. Okay, 3 nights for you in Dublin, getting ready for the Aer Lingus College Football Classic. And again, all of these hospitality packages and travel packages over at cats2ireland.com, they include your ticket to the game. And as I've told you, things are starting to run out. So if you are still on the fence about it, have a quick conversation with whoever it's important with and say, we're going to watch Cats in Dublin in August, because it'll be a lot more fun than sitting on your couch and watching it. Although I know people like my dad will be like, couch is going to be pretty nice. Guy doesn't like to spend money. Guy doesn't like to travel. Does he like having fun? You got to question that sometimes. Let's see the Irish fun fact as we close out the show today, Drew.
All right, so the game is August 23rd, as we know. August 16th through the 24th is National Heritage Week in Ireland. It's all about celebrating all things heritage in Ireland. It brings the communities, families, organizations, cultural institutions, academics, and enthusiasts to just build awareness about the value of heritage and support of just Irish culture. It started in 2005, and it has grown from a small 500 a small 500 people event to now like there's 2,000 people involved with Irish Heritage Week. I don't have any details about like where it's going to be or like what they're really going to be doing, but they're going to celebrate Irish Heritage Week over there.
Okay, well, that's you get the full experience then if you go over there and watch the game between K-State and Iowa State. What are we thinking the best way that you're going to spend your time on a long flight to Ireland is?
Oh, I'll be watching at least 3 movies probably.
Well, Drew learned last year that for whatever reason,
Top Gun is your go-to.
when I'm in a plane, I'm like, I really want to feel the real experience there. So I watched both Top Gun movies last year. I can't remember if that was for Media Day or BYU trip.
Both.
No, I couldn't have been both. I would not have done that for really. Would I have? I don't think so. I think the travel for getting to BYU is maybe a little too choppy for me to be like, not in terms of how it was in the air, just how crappy the situation was on the way back with waiting around all day. I was not in the mood to take in a movie.
No, I think it was Vegas was your Top Gun experience. I don't know. I might watch like Harry Potter maybe, and some of the Harry Potters on the way there.
Well, that's get you a little bit closer to that area. Although I guess still got some ocean between Ireland and England where they would be. I'm gonna have to figure it out. I'll take some books. I always take a book with me places, and I have the intention to read, and then I just never do. So it really all comes down to like, if I open the book, I will read the whole thing, but it takes a lot to push me over the edge to actually opening it. So.
There's definitely people that are like, why aren't you guys going to be watching like anything about Iowa State or like have your Phil Steele? I will not have my Phil Steele with me on the way to Ireland. I'll be watching movies. And
no, I just want to walk into that game assuming that Iowa State sucks. And, I'm going to have 60 minutes of football to tell me if I was right or wrong. And I'm sure after that game, I'll probably know way too much about Iowa State than what I wanted to.
My flight to Dallas in July, I'll probably have my Phil Steele with me then to pass the time. There are direct flights from Atlanta to Dallas, so we're chilling.
No Atlanta, Ireland, though, for you, it sounds like.
No, because I got to fly from Atlanta to Kansas City and Kansas City to wherever we're going and wherever we're stopping.
Chicago.
And then Chicago to Ireland.
Yeah.
It's gonna be a good day.
Yeah, let's see. I've looked it up before and to see what the flight times are, how long it would take. It's a little under. Aer Lingus says it's less than an 8-hour flight from Chicago to Dublin. So Dublin. I don't know why I said Dublin. Dublin. 7 hours, 50 minutes. Now that is Dublin to Chicago, so I don't know if it's going to change a little bit on us. But that's something to keep in mind. So
Yeah,
everybody watch out. Get your things planned out accordingly for how long you're going to be
in
occupying
the air.
yourself on the plane. Yeah. Ours is going to be at night, so I guess sleep. Drew has no problem falling asleep on planes. I've
No.
recognized that. So he'll probably sleep a good chunk of it, but we'll
Yeah,
figure it
get
out.
me in the air and I'm chilling the rest of the way.
Yeah. So, all right, that'll do it for today. We're out of here. K-State, Iowa State. We are still a little over 3 months away, but we're getting closer and closer to being exactly 3. So that is an exciting thing to think about. And we'll talk more about K-State football tomorrow. Recruiting update on Thursday, and then Friday we will start discussing our countdown of the ranking every quarterback that's attempted a pass since 2006 for K-State football. It includes 2 running backs that played a decent amount in a Wildcat capacity, just to make it a round list of 25. And no, despite his best efforts, Courtney Messingham did not get Deuce Vaughn included as one of those. Actually, do you want to put Deuce on there as honorable mention 26th? Because that was disastrous. It was not his fault, but I mean,
We can put him as honorable mention. This list also includes a guy that I had no idea even existed.
yeah, no offense to
No offense.
when those guys come across. Somebody's got to be ranked, like 18th and 25th. Is Courtney Messingham with Deuce in the Wildcat Black Friday at Texas? Is that the worst coaching job at K-State in the last? I'm trying to put a year on it. I mean, you say 5, it's like, okay, so of the Kleiman era, yeah, that's probably the worst decision that was made.
Of the last 10, I would still probably say yes.
I don't know. That would include 2015 and 2018 Bill Snyder teams. And it's not like they had maybe some of the soundest decisions being made there.
No, but
2015, what are you going to do about it? Jesse Ertz got hurt, first
Yeah.
series of the season. So I guess you take some of that out of the equation. We will talk Cody Cook and Joe Huebner when we count down quarterbacks. So be on the lookout for that. The first written piece for that will come out, I believe, tomorrow, maybe Thursday. So you'll kind of have the little guide there, and then Drew and I will dissect all of it starting on Friday, and we'll do it every Friday throughout the end of May. We're out of here. For Drew Galloway, I'm Mason Voth. Thanks for watching and listening to the KSO Show.